This is Justin Ford From the Frontline. Tonight we will be discussing Christmas on the Frontline. In the studio with me is Dr. Peter Hammond, the founder of Frontline Fellowship, who has been involved in serving persecuted Christians for over 40 years in 38 countries. Dr. Hammond, we often hear the refrain of peace on earth, goodwill towards all men at Christmas time. But what about during times of war?
Yes, and it's so relevant now with the horrible wars going on in the Middle East and Ukraine, and especially in Ukraine we've got Christians on both sides. Well, actually the worst war in history was literally stopped on Christmas Day. On Christmas Eve 1914, a spontaneous ceasefire was observed across the whole of the Western Front, including over 100,000 troops, frontline troops who took part in it. And the Christmas Truce of the First World War was a stunning event, unprecedented in the history of warfare. It initially received widespread media coverage. The New York Times on New Year's Eve, 31st of December 1914, published pictures of it, and that was followed by British newspapers such as the Mirror, the Illustrated London News, and the Times. In January of 1915, they printed front-page photographs of British and German soldiers mingling, singing Christmas carols in no man's land. And the French government was the first to severely censor any of these reports on what they called fraternization with the enemy. So immense political pressure was brought to bear to censor all reports of the event from the mainstream history books for decades. And I recall people saying, even when I was at school, that it was fiction, it never happened, it's an urban legend. But for years, this extraordinary event was only known by word of mouth from the participants. And I met people who participated in these things. And as a young boy, I heard some of these stories, and it was quite extraordinary. And then in 2014, when it was the 100th anniversary of the Christmas Truce and of the outbreak of the First World War, I went on speaking tour to Great Britain and went to the Imperial War Museum, where they had an entire exhibit on the Christmas Truce with photographic evidence of what the government had said never happened, and which the media had called fake news for decades. And, well, the fact is that the damage done by the Christmas Truce to the propaganda campaigns of the governments who sought to demonize the enemy, this was regarded as such a serious threat to the war. It has taken decades to actually unearth the details of the fascinating events surrounding Christmas 1914. In some cases, when some of the veterans of the war died and granddad's letters to grandma were unearthed out of the attics and the basements, and then a whole new generation discovered, goodness me, granddad or great-granddad was involved in this, and here's his description, there's his pictures. And so all of these came out, and suddenly books were being published and articles in newspapers and magazines on this incredible event. So in the first 5 months of the Great War, they didn't call it the First World War, they didn't know there'd be a sequel, so it was called the Great War at first. Over 1 million Europeans had already been killed. So by December 1914, 1 million Europeans had been killed in action, most by artillery fire. And the initially fast-moving campaigns had degenerated into static trench warfare. There was a continuous front line of barbed wire trenches running from the North Sea to the Swiss frontier across Belgium and France. And that's the context, that's the background to the Christmas Truce.
So how did this Christmas truce come about? Was it organized or spontaneous? Did anyone advocate for a Christmas truce?
No, it was definitely not organized, and yes, it was spontaneous. But there was one prominent person who did publicly advocate a Christmas truce, and it's someone with a strong connection to South Africa. Emily Hobhouse, the famous Englishwoman who had exposed to the world the horrors of Lord Kitchener's scorched earth campaign against the Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Free State. She had also been the first to make known the horrors of the British concentration camps in South Africa. So Emily Hobhouse was the most prominent campaigner against British involvement in the First World War, and she was the first to suggest a truce over Christmas in 1914. So Emily Hobhouse authored the Open Christmas Letter, calling for peace. 101 prominent British women signed Emily's Open Christmas Letter, and this was endorsed by 155 prominent German and Austrian women in response. And the heading was, On Earth Peace, Goodwill Towards Men. And Emily Hobhouse wrote, Sisters, the Christmas message sounds like a mockery to a world at war. But those of us who wished and still wish for peace may surely offer a solemn greeting to such as who feel as we do. And she mentioned that, as in South Africa during the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902, the brunt of modern war falls upon non-combatants. and the conscience of the world cannot bear the sight. And she wrote, "Is it not our mission to preserve life? Do not humanity and common sense alike prompt us to join hands with the woman and urge our rulers to stave off further bloodshed? May Christmas hasten that day."
What response did her letter receive?
Well, the German mothers responded, "To our English sisters, sisters of the same race, our warm and heartfelt thanks for your Christmas greetings. Women of the belligerent countries, with all faithfulness, devotion, and love for our countries, can go beyond it and maintain true solidarity with the women of other belligerent nations, that really civilized women never lose their humanity." And Emily also oversaw the raising of funds and the shipping of food and medicines to the women and children of Germany and Austria who were suffering starvation as a result of the English hunger blockade, the naval blockade, which traditionally naval blockades had been to keep out weapons of war, but the British in the First World War extended to food as well, and therefore it was also known as the hunger blockade or the starvation blockade. And people were literally dying of starvation in Vienna, Austria, and throughout Germany and Austria. So numerous ministers picked up Emily's campaign and proclaimed from the pulpits that the guns may fall silent, at least upon the night when the angels sang. And although these messages were officially rebuffed, and they were suppressed in the very heavily censored media, many of the soldiers in the front line seemed to share these sentiments, whether they heard of them directly or by word of mouth. They certainly wouldn't have read of them in the official newspapers. But this stunning suggestion of Emily Hobhouse, "Let's have a truce on Christmas Eve," did spread through the front lines. And whether they heard it or not, they certainly shared the sentiments, because more than 100,000 troops actually participated in the Christmas Truce on the Western Front in 1914.
Now, how did the Christmas Truce come about on the ground?
Well, from the first week of December, informal truces were being observed by soldiers on the front line. In a historic letter, 7th of December 1914, Charles de Gaulle, who later became President of France, he expressed his dismay with the fraternization with the enemy, where French and German troops exchanged newspapers, recovered their dead, organized burial parties in no man's land, and he said this is very disturbing. The French General de Urbel expressed alarm over soldiers spending too much time in the same sector because they became friendly with the enemies, to the extent that soldiers were conducting conversations between the lines and even visiting one another's trenches. So this was starting already early December. And then after heavy rains near Ypres, where the Germans held the high ground, the British on the lower ground, their trenches became flooded. And so English troops came out of their flooded trenches in full view of the Germans, who expressed their sympathy and didn't open fire on their soaked, vulnerable enemies. So that already showed that there's some kind of thawing of the hostilities. And then the 2nd Essex Regiment recorded on the 11th of December in their war diary, their officers and men met the German Saxon Corps between the trenches and exchanged food, cigarettes, chocolates, and conversations. It was noted that the Germans had great wine and the British had better chocolates, and they enjoyed conversations together. So that's the East Saxons meeting the German Saxons. And then on Christmas Eve, German troops began decorating their trenches with Christmas trees. For some reason, the Kaiser sent trainloads of Christmas trees to the front, and there was a tree for every 2 meters of the trenches stretching all the way from Belgium through to Switzerland. And that's a phenomenal amount of Christmas trees. And I think there was a bit of guilt in the government. They'd said the war would be over by Christmas. And so suddenly they started to flood Christmas cakes and wine and Christmas trees to the soldiers at the front. I think they were feeling somewhat guilty that this war had gone on much longer than they'd initially promised. And so the German soldiers were decorating their trenches with these Christmas trees and candles. And the Christmas truce began in the region of Ypres in Belgium, where the Germans were enthusiastically singing Christmas carols in their trenches. And at the singing of Silent Night, the British soldiers joined in, singing in English. Of course, the Germans were singing in German the same song to the same tune. And then the British responded with some carols of their own, like "O Come All Ye Faithful," and then the two sides began shouting Christmas greetings at each other. And shortly after that, the soldiers spontaneously came out of their trenches, walked across no man's land to greet one another, to exchange gifts and to exchange souvenirs. And then they started swapping ration packs, and the French had good wines, the Germans had great chocolates, the British had the best pies, and they were all just happily sharing with one another. And this truce spread rapidly across the entire Western Front. Over 100,000 German and British troops were involved in this official ending of fighting, or suspension of fighting. And soon there were Australian, New Zealand, Canadian, Belgian, French troops joining in the Christmas celebrations in the frozen strip of no man's land. And they said the land was very frozen, and it was such a cold night. Everything had frozen, which included the corpses, the blood, the decomposing corpses. It would have been a horrible smell normally in no man's land, but everything was so frozen over that they could walk on solid ground. And there were respectful burial services conducted by combatants for the dead between the lines. Soldiers literally swapped ration packs and chocolates and souvenirs and buttons and badges and hats. And the pictures are quite confusing, because you can see pictures and there's German soldiers in German uniforms wearing British hats, and there's British soldiers in British uniforms wearing German hats or helmets, and French and so on. And so they are sharing one another's hats and helmets. And there was a whole lot of interesting events afterwards where they had to come between lines and say, the hat that I gave you, could you give that back? We've got inspection coming up. And they were swapping things back and returning it later. And there was all kinds of tremendous interaction that happened afterwards. The next day, Christmas Day, there were football matches played between the lines. And a British officer, Robert Grays, wrote of the football match between the 133rd Saxon Regiment and his Scottish troops. The Germans won 3-2, he recorded. And then the Glasgow News on the 2nd of January reported the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders won their match 4-1. And the Royal Field Artillery Lieutenant Albert Wynne wrote of their soccer match against the Hanoverians near Ypres on Christmas Day. And commanders threatened repercussions for what they called this lack of discipline. Numerous officers actually ordered the artillery open fire on these fraternizing troops in no man's land. Well, that, of course, would have killed their own men too, because they're all intermingled. But on none of these occasions did any of the artillery obey orders. So there are complaints on record of officers shocked at what they called the total breakdown of discipline. Men point-blank refused to open fire on their own soldiers mingled with the enemy in no man's land. And General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien, who is known in South Africa because he was one of the only redcoat survivors of the Battle of East Luanda. The Zulus particularly targeted the redcoats. About the only survivors had been people wearing blue uniforms like in artillery and so on. But Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien was a survivor of the Battle of East Luanda. He actually escaped across Fugitives Drift and one of the very, very, very few survivors in wearing red coats. He was commanding the British Second Corps, and he issued orders forbidding any fraternization with the enemy, as he called it. And then he complained his orders were disregarded by the soldiers and his officers. And so Smith-Dorrien comes out as one of the complainers, and we know a lot about the Christmas Truce because of his official reports complaining about it. And then there's Richard Shireman, who was so impressed by the camaraderie experienced between his German regiment and the French soldiers during the Christmas Truce. They even exchanged addresses with one another. He went on to found the Youth Hostel Association in 1919 to provide meeting places where young men of all countries could come to get to know one another. And so these are just some of the things that were inspired and came out of the Christmas Truce.
Did the Christmas Truce only occur on the Western Front? Was it a Western Front phenomenon?
No, at first we thought so, but recent reports have come out showing there was a general observance of a Christmas truce across the whole of the Eastern Front, where German, Austrian, Hungarian and Russian commanders observed ceasefires for the duration of Christmas. Now, unlike the Western Front, where it was totally spontaneous from the ground against the orders of the officers, on the Eastern Front, the interesting thing is the commanders, German, Austrian, Hungarian and Russian, ordered no offensive action during the duration of both the Western calendar, 24th December, and the Eastern calendar, 6th of January. So there was a 2-week Christmas truce in the Eastern Front. And this came from the top down. This was the officers in charge actually said no offensive actions, only fire if fired upon, don't initiate any hostile actions. And this was observed across the entire Eastern Front with the exception of Serbia. The Serbians, who were a terror-sponsoring rogue nation, and who had actually started the war with arming those terrorists and training them, who had assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, in Sarajevo, the Serbians refused to observe any truce. They fought the whole way through. So the Austrians had to fight back on that side. But between the Russians and the Germans and Austrians, there was a complete, total 2-week Christmas truce as well. They even came out, celebrated together, and there was a lot of fraternization. We haven't heard of any of the football matches in the Eastern Front like there was in the Western Front, but there certainly was celebration of Christmas and singing of hymns together on the Eastern Front. What's amazing is that they respected both calendars, the Eastern calendar and the Western calendar. The Russians celebrate Christmas on the 6th of January, for example. So you saw this respect even for the other people's calendar, which is amazing.
What did the governments, the high commands and the authorities think about all of this?
They were horrified and they were hostile. And there were numerous French and British officers who were court-martialed for participating in what they called fraternization of the enemy. The French actually had 500 officers executed for what they called mutiny. And there was one French general ordered that a cat who was wandering between the lines and spending time in the German trenches and the French, that he be put in a firing squad and shot. Well, none of the soldiers could find this cat, so it didn't happen, but they actually gave out that order, which is, that's how silly and ridiculous the whole thing became, that a cat who goes wherever he wants anyway was literally condemned to death in absentia. So whole units had to be pulled back from the front. The British had to send some of them off to the Iraq front and to fight the Turks and so on. The Germans had to pull whole units out and send them to the Eastern Front because they were getting too pally with the people on the other side of the Western Front. And there was this display of reluctance to fire on what they called the enemy that they'd just celebrated Christmas with. So numerous artillery units began to fire only at precise locations on prearranged times to avoid causing casualties. So if they're told to open fire, they would send a message and say, we have to give an artillery barrage, but please be observant at this time. We'll be firing at this position, just avoid that area and so on. And so there were many instances of soldiers firing high and ineffectually reported artillery firing where they knew there were no enemy, so-called. And there were actually times of them coming across and sheltering in one another's lines when they knew there's going to be a bombardment on your lines, come and join us in our trenches, and vice versa. So there was a lot of instances of soldiers who continued the Christmas truce effectively for weeks to come afterwards.
And what happened in subsequent years? Was this a 1914 phenomenon alone, or were there ever any other attempts at a Christmas truce?
There were other attempts. Now, the British government issued very detailed orders on how to suppress future Christmas truces so that they would order general artillery barrages on Christmas Eve to deter mingling across the lines and things like this. But still, an Easter Sunday truce was attempted by the German units in 1915, and these were normally suppressed by British artillery fire. But in November 1915, a Saxon unit briefly fraternized with a Liverpool battalion, and they conducted respectful burial services together. In December 1915, there was an explicit order from Allied commanders, elaborate procedures made to forestall any attempt at the previous Christmas truce. But even the multiple artillery barrages ordered across the entire front line throughout Christmas Day, ordered by the British authorities, they were not completely effective. And there were a number of Christmas truces observed on the Western Front in Christmas 1915. And on some sections, carols and gifts were exchanged between the British and German troops. There was at least one football match with about 50 soldiers on each side playing football recorded in 1915. And Sir Ian Calhoun of the Scots Guard was actually court-martialed for defying orders by maintaining a short truce to bury the dead between lines Christmas Day 1915. And because he is related to the British Prime Minister H.H. Asquith, this punishment was commuted. Otherwise, he would have been shot by firing squad for that Christmas truce. So there was very determined attempts. We are not going to have this happen again. And there were German attempts in December 1916 and 1917 to observe Christmas truces rebuffed by British artillery barrages. Now, of course, the artillery are behind the lines. They're not in the very front line, and so they don't see the enemy. And so it was easier to get the artillery to open fire, and that forestalled people coming out of their trenches and gathering. But recent evidence came to light of a successful Christmas truce in 1916 between the German and Canadian troops at Vimy Ridge. Vimy Ridge is where the Canadians have their memorial because many Canadians died in Vimy Ridge. And so the Canadians and Germans exchanged Christmas gifts and greetings. And the Canadians and Germans visited one of the lines also on the 25th of December 1916. That was particularly at Vimy Ridge, which is in Belgium.
What happened after the First World War? Was the Christmas Truce recorded in the history books?
No, not at first. But later it came out. I think that whole generation basically had to be thinned out before the government relinquished the tight control. It's like 70 years it was not allowed to be believed. And then suddenly, as we approached the 100th anniversary of the First World War, there were all these grandpa's letters coming out from the attic and the basements, and things being told and people relating this on their deathbed, what happened. And so finally, the Christmas Truce is now openly acknowledged. The Imperial War Museum in London have many photographs of German and British troops celebrating Christmas together. And in 2005, the French film Joyeux Noël dramatized the Christmas Truce in 1914 through the eyes of French, Scottish and German soldiers in the Western Front. And that's an excellent film to see. I highly recommend it. Joyeux Noël. It's spelled Joyeux, Noel, Noe, with the umlauts, the two dots over the E and L. Joyeux Noël, or Merry Christmas in French. And that film is very good, a 2005 film on a French truce. And then Sainsbury's, in 2014, on the 100th anniversary of the Christmas Truce, Sainsbury's produced a very moving tribute to the Christmas Truce, an extraordinary advert, probably the best advert ever made from my perspective. And they got the legions and the veterans to help them get the details right. The uniforms, the trench details, absolutely striking. So you can Google Sainsbury's Christmas Truce ad and you'll find it. It's very well done. We've also put on our web a few clips from the Joyeux Noël movie, which I see has had 13 million views, upload on YouTube. So you can look there. Christmas Truce clips from Joyeux Noël film of 2005. And millions of views, absolutely powerful. Just showing the actual section of how the Christmas Truce began and the joint services and so on, the football matches. So now it's entrenched in popular culture. There have been a few songs made, quite a few memorials set up. They've got memorials in Belgium at Ypres, which I've been to, where you can see a German soldier reaching forward and a British soldier reaching forward, shaking hands over a footballs just below. And there's been a few memorials set up. There's in France and Belgium, there's numerous actual memorials, and sometimes you get the regiments that took part in it gathering again symbolically, having a football match and reaching across the wall, shaking hands, and German, French, Belgian, British units all taking part. So it's now fully accepted. But for nearly a century, it was fake news, didn't happen, urban legend, lies and so on, and just rejected. And now it's all come out. Amazing. It makes you wonder what is it that we believe today, or don't believe, but will be exposed in 100 years' time. So it took almost 100 years for the truth of the Christmas Truce to really come out.
Did anything like this happen in the Second World War?
Yes, well, according to my father, who was a bombardier in the Royal Artillery in the 8th Army, he told me of a Christmas truce observed between the German Afrika Korps and the British 8th Army, that they sang Christmas carols, they walked across on Christmas Eve, on Christmas Day, they came across the lines between a barbed wire and they shook hands, they played football and shopped ration packs. And he said, because they've got different things in their ration packs, it was a nice change. And, the Germans had great chocolates and they liked the British pies and German wines were good and things like this. So it did happen. I've never read about that anyway. I've never read a single history book that talks about it. But my father told me. And that's amazing to think that could have happened. I also came across a book called A Higher Call. They're talking about making a film on it, and they certainly should. Well, A Higher Call is a story of an extraordinary event that occurred over northern Germany near Bremen just before Christmas. There was a Luftwaffe fighter pilot, Franz Steigler, who was an ace, and he came across a stricken, shot to pieces American B-17 bomber, which had just been bombing Bremen. And so this is very close to Bremen. And this Luftwaffe pilot, he comes with his Messerschmitt, and as he approaches on the back, he wonders, why is the rear gunner not fired? And he goes a bit closer, his thumb is over the firing button, and then he sees the rear gunner's dead, and he's slumped over his Browning machine gun. And then he follows along the side, and he sees the whole B-17 is ripped apart, and he can actually see the wounded people being treated inside, and he goes right up alongside the pilot, and the pilot's name is actually Charlie Brown, but not the cartoon character, it's a real person. So he sees Charlie Brown, and Charlie Brown froze when he saw this Messerschmitt. He said, it was my worst nightmare, right next to him, and he thought, why is he playing with us? And then Franz Stagler saluted and then indicated, follow me, and he led this stricken B-17 out over the North Sea and showed him the way to England and pointed him there, and then saluted and returned to Germany. Now, the B-17 had lost all its instrument panels. It was going in the wrong direction, deeper into enemy territory, and it would have, they would run out of petrol, they would have crashed. He was amazed it was still flying. But he saved their lives by grace. It was just before Christmas, and apparently Franz Stagler in the book, he says how he put his hand around the cross that he wore under his uniform as he was praying and thinking, what do I do with these people? Because he thought, he could shoot down his plane, he could get the credits, which would have qualified him at that moment for the Blue Max, the Knight's Cross, basically, which was the highest award he could get in the Luftwaffe. But he didn't shoot down the plane. He saved the lives of those pilots. And later, Charlie Brown was obsessed with finding the man who had spared them and to want to thank him. And it's an extraordinary story. Went through the High Call book a couple of times. It's absolutely incredible insights from both the American bomber pilot and the German Luftwaffe fighter pilot. And the Franz Stagler had been in the Africa Corps, he had fought in North Africa, and they had a code of honor, and what he called a higher call, that he was descent from the knights or Teutonic knights of the Middle Ages, and you don't shoot a man in a parachute, you don't kill a wounded soldier, you don't treat your enemy without mercy, because he said, as his officer commanding it said to him, you don't do it for your enemy, you do it for yourself. You do not want to lower yourself to their level. They might shoot pilots in a parachute, they might strafe or bomb civilians. You don't do that. You've got to treat your enemy better. You don't want to descend to becoming like your enemy. You must show mercy, you must show grace. In fact, his officer commanding said in the Africa Corps, if you ever shoot a pilot in a parachute, I will shoot you. And he was thinking, this is a stricken bomber. It's a bomber. It's bad. It just bombed Bremen. But these people are helpless. They're absolutely at my mercy. He could shoot them down, no problem. But he just knew that was wrong. He needed to show mercy, and he's approaching Christmas. And so there's this extraordinary story about all his life choices that came around in this critical thing on the eve of Christmas. He showed mercy to an enemy bomber crew. And later in his life, they got together over 70 people, the children, grandchildren, descended from the survivors of that crew. So that's one amazing story, but it's an extraordinary testimony to the power of the gospel during such a terrible time of World War, that soldiers of so many armies on opposite sides could stop fighting, come out of their trenches, and embrace their enemies in honor of the Prince of Peace.
Just bringing it up to date, I believe there have been calls for a truce in the Ukraine, but over Christmas. But apparently the Zelensky character won't agree to it.
That is correct. In fact, already in 2022, Vladimir Putin, President of Russia, ordered no offensive actions over Christmas season, only fired upon, which is roughly what the commanders gave on the Eastern Front back in 1914. Fair enough, if you're under attack, you must respond, but don't initiate offensive actions over the Christmas season. Unfortunately, the Zelensky government deliberately ordered offensive actions in order to ensure that there was no Christmas truce. Perhaps they didn't want to honor Christ. Perhaps they didn't want to acknowledge that there's Christians on both sides of this conflict. But for whatever reason, the Russian attempts at having a Christmas truce in 2022 and 2023 were rebuffed. We certainly pray that there will be some kind of Christmas truce observed now, especially as they're getting close to the end of the war, and it just seems so pointless. Why must more people die? War is bad enough. It's wonderful when people can just stop for a moment and realize Jesus is the Prince of Peace. He is the King of Kings. He is the one we will have to answer to on the last day. So I certainly hope that there will be some Christmas truces observed, especially up in Russia and Ukraine during this Christmas season, but that does require both sides to cooperate.
Yeah, and it also resonates what you said about the Russian and the Germans' leadership on the Eastern Front in World War I actually agreeing to a truce, whereas now there seems to be incredible tension between Russia and Germany. So that well, at least between the governments. So
I think that's the whole point.
Yeah.
The people on the ground don't always have malice against one another. It's the governments. And I remember my father saying we felt more compassion with our enemies than we did to our own governments. He said, we knew our government who had put us here. They didn't know what it's like to live in sandstorms and with dust, lice, and the boiling heat. My dad said he could literally just clean a bit of surface on his 25-pounder and crack an egg on it, and it would completely cook. The heat was so much from the sun. And the Africa Corps understood the thirst, the heat, the dust storms, the lice and everything. But the people back home did not. And so he said, we actually felt more camaraderie with our enemy than we did with our families and friends back home. Certainly the governments. And my father also mentioned how they respected Erwin Rommel, the Field Marshal of the Afrika Korps, much more than they respected their own generals on the 8th Army side. So much so that Winston Churchill mentioned this as a real problem in the House of Parliament in Britain, that the 8th Army has more respect for Erwin Rommel than for their own generals. And this was such a crisis that they found a real, what do you call it, a man who's a
charismatic leader.
Yes, they found one of these people as a prima donna, I think was the term used, in Field Marshal Montgomery, and they decked him out with all kinds of attempts to make him larger than life. And so he had this weird beret with vast amounts of medals on it, and he was pictured in the turret of a tank, and like one of the men, like Erwin Rommel, they tried to build a real hero cult around Montgomery. But my dad said we didn't buy it. We still knew Erwin Rommel was the real thing. And interestingly, my dad made a comment which sounded strange to me, but I later found out was true. He said that Field Marshal Montgomery had a picture on a stand of Erwin Rommel next to his bedstand. Now, I mean, it's the sort of thing you don't forget hearing because it sounds so bizarre. But in 2014, on the 100th anniversary of the First World War, I went to the Imperial War Museum, and the lowest floor, the first floor at the Imperial War Museum was all First World War. But in the second floor, they had Second World War. And there was a recreated tent of Field Marshal Montgomery. And what was on the bedside table? This picture that my dad said was on Field Marshal Montgomery's table of Erwin Rommel. And yeah, I mean, just strange. You don't expect to see that at the Imperial War Museum, but there it was, vindicating that what my dad had said was not exaggerate. That's actually true. And we also saw in a book on General Patton that he kept Erwin Rommel's book on tank attacks and infantry attacks was on his bedside table. He would read them at night. That was his last thing to read at night. He said, because Rommel is the gold standard. This is what he aspired to be like. And Patton said a lot of his successes in war was because he read Rommel's book. He followed the textbook of the master. And America's most successful general, although assassinated by his own side, mind you, but still, it just goes to show. So I don't think it's the people on the ground that have the malice and animosity. It's the governments. And that's why I heard some people saying, it would be better when it comes to war. Why don't you just send the politicians into the front? When Obama was trying to pick a fight with Russia some time ago, I was suggesting, well, why don't we do back in the days of David and Goliath, put the two presidents in a ring together and let them sort it out. In fact, I'd like to see that. Put Obama or Biden in a ring with Vladimir Putin and see what happens. You'd have to film it and watch it in slow motion, see what happened. Or for that matter, put Zelensky and Vladimir Putin in a ring together. See how quick that one gets resolved. But that would be so much better. I think the Christmas Truce shows that the demonized picture of the enemy was not in any sense true, and the men on the ground knew it. And they interacted with one another despite everything the government and the newspapers said. And they found, these are real people who understand us. Nobody understands a frontline soldier more than another frontline soldier. And the people who've been in the trenches, and you can imagine your feet are in water and you've got rats running all over the place and there's all the lice and other things in the front line, the hideous smell of decomposing corpses and all these horrible things. The guys back home know nothing about that. And the media wouldn't report the realities of the front line, but the troops on the other side, they might have been your enemies, but they were closer to you than your own family and government. Anyway, that's what my father told me, and I also had a veteran of the Eastern Front and the Africa Corps, Professor Fritz House, was my Old Testament professor at Baptist Theological Seminary. And he gave me a similar insight as to how they were and how they were praying at the front line and how the camaraderie between them and the enemies. When I mentioned to him that I'd just had lunch with Ian Smith, who had been shot down twice in the Second World War, including in North Africa, my professor Fritz House said, I'm so glad that this brother survived, because we shot down a lot of hurricanes in North Africa. And Ian Smith was flying a hurricane at the time that he crashed there. When he was shot down over Italy, he was flying a Spitfire, but he was flying hurricanes in North Africa. Fritz House's first concern was for this brother in Christ who had been on the other side. And you could just see this strong camaraderie, absolutely unique and extraordinary. Now, of course, what we're talking about can only happen amongst Christian people. You're not going to get Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, atheists adhering to a Christmas truce. They don't have the same respect for Christ. But this is what was so extraordinary about the First and Second World War. Christians fighting one another, which is tragic and terrible. But there was this decency and this respect for one's enemy. And I've met South Africans who fought in North Africa, even people of my unit, 6 South African infantry, who were defeated and captured at the Battle of Tobruk. And they ended up spending the last few years of the war as prisoners of war. And what they had to say, how well they were treated. So there's just one amazing little anecdote about Erwin Rommel. A South African general had been captured in Tobruk, and so he was invited to the Field Marshal's tent for supper, which was apparently a typical courtesy shown to captured enemy. So he arrives there, and Erwin Rommel asked, "Where's your hat?" And the man said, "One of your men took it as a souvenir." So Erwin Rommel barked out an order in German, and aide-de-camp came to him, and he rattled off some instructions in German. And shortly afterwards, another officer came running into the tent, came to a firm halt, saluted, and handed back the hat to this South African general. And the South African general was so impressed by this chivalry that he offered his goggles to Erwin Rommel. He had very little to give. He's a prisoner. And for the rest of the war, Erwin Rommel wore those South African goggles. Now, if you look at the pictures of Erwin Rommel, like the book my dad always had, and you can see his Africa Corps cap, but he's got these South African goggles on him. Now, most people don't recognize those aren't German-issue goggles. Those are South African-issue goggles. And Erwin Rommel wore those for the rest of the war, and so over his hat, these goggles, which was a gift from a South African prisoner of war. Now, I only know the story because the daughter of this man related it to a moth meeting, a memorial order tin hat, about her father's goggles, which ended up on Erwin Rommel's cap, and most of his pictures included. I don't know how many people have picked that up, that's not German-issue goggles. It's unique to Erwin Rommel because he was gifted this by a South African infantry general. So, this just shows you there's a camaraderie and a respect from Christian people who treat even the enemies well, because Jesus commanded us to love our enemies.
Yeah. Dr. Hammond, as we head into Christmas, do you have any other messages for our listeners? Are there any other items for prayer and or upcoming events that we should know about?
Yes, certainly. I think it's so important that we remind people of the reason for the season. Wise men still seek Christ. And so just whether you're at a shop and you are at a till to sometimes say, do you remember whose birthday we're celebrating? Or I wonder how many people here remember whose birthday we're celebrating. And that sort of just stops, and you can see sometimes these shopkeepers, the cogwheels are moving, and suddenly the light of recognition comes to face. And yes, no, that's so important. And I think that's so important. It's also important to tell children, why do we receive gifts on Christmas Day? It's not our birthday. And then to say, what gift are you going to give Jesus on his birthday? And just asking that question, you can see many children, they stop and the cogwheels have to move as they think, yes, that's right, it's Jesus' birthday. I should be giving him a gift. It's not that I should receive gifts. And, why do we give and receive gifts? Because the wise men who came at Christmas, they brought gifts to the Lord Jesus. And God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. So I think it's important to remind people of that right there. Also, there's some excellent Christmas films I could recommend, especially for people who might be alone at Christmas. There's a very good film made on the Nativity called The Nativity Story. It's got such good jeopardy. It's so well presented. It's a dramatic film. It's very well put together. And Movie Guide called it an almost perfect film. And it really is. So the Nativity Story is good. I also like watching Ben-Hur at this time quite a lot. And the most enjoyable activity is to go and watch a live performance of Handel's Messiah. And if you can't watch a live performance, at least Google it and watch it online or listen to it and in the background. And personally, while my wife and daughter Daniela have often sung in choirs Handel's Messiah, so I got to see live performances often. And it's all scripture. They're singing scripture, solid scripture. It's absolutely tremendous. Handel's Messiah sounds like heaven. I can imagine that's exactly what heaven sounds like. And I would highly recommend it. Interestingly enough, I think the best one you can see online is if you put the Tabernacle Choir, Handel's Messiah. Tabernacle Choir is absolutely excellent. Musically, it's just a perfect performance. So I would think if you want, Google Handel's Messiah, and you could do Cambridge University Choir. That's brilliant. Christ Church, Cambridge, Handel's Messiah, that's high stand. But I personally think the Tabernacle Choir does it the very, very best. And so that's something else to enjoy over Christmas. The Christmas Carol, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens is a great book. And it's actually the book that formed Christmas during the Victorian era. And so I'd highly recommend, you could get an audio book online easily. You can read the book. But A Christmas Carol, if you want to see the film, there's been a lot of film adaptations. I think A Christmas Carol, where George C. Scott acted in it, was the best one I've ever seen. I think A Christmas Carol is well worth watching. It puts things into perspective. My wife's favorite film was A Wonderful Life, which with Jimmy Stewart in it. A Wonderful Life is a great Christmas season film. But singing Christmas carols, you get some of the best doctrine and theology possible in Christmas carols. Singing Christmas carols, listening to Christmas carols, that's absolutely magnificent. The Nativity Story, Ben-Hur, A Christmas Carol, these are all films we can highly recommend. But Handel's Messiah is the best way to celebrate Christmas in so many ways. Also, we could recommend people to just reach out to strangers and people who are alone at Christmas. And in our family, we celebrate Christmas Eve as our time for the family and for presents exchange and so on, which is the German tradition. My wife being brought up in Austria, my mom being brought up in Germany, we've always celebrated Christmas Eve. And Christmas Day, we tend to invite what my wife called strays, people who were without their family in town and so on, to our home for Christmas Day lunch. And maybe there's people who could invite tomorrow morning at Christmas service to join you for Christmas lunch if you have some space at your table. That's another way. We've also adopted quite a few cats over Christmas time. Once we fostered cats who were in locked up in a cage over Christmas season. We thought, well, let's foster them over the Christmas season that they can be out of their cage. Of course, we end up adopting them all. You can't help but do that sort of thing. Many Christmases we've adopted pets, and I think that's another great way to celebrate Christmas, to care for God's animals. So That's part of it. Some upcoming events we would really appreciate prayer for. We've got our Biblical Worldview Summit beginning on the 3rd of January. Please pray for us. We need sponsorship for people who want to sponsor, who can't afford to pay for the expenses of this course and the Great Commission course that follows it. The Biblical Worldview Summit is a 1-week intensive worldview program to prepare young people for how to be an effective witness in hostile environments like universities, to know what they believe, why they believe it, how to defend it in judgment, in argument, how to win fellow students or lecturers, for that matter, to Christ in hostile environments. And so we deal with everything from creation, evolution, transgenderism, all the LGBTQ, secular humanist, hostility for Christianity, the New World Disorder. And so if you are interested in a course like that, or you want to sponsor your son or grandson to attend this, it's a wonderful intensive program that'll stretch their minds and their muscles. And that's followed up with a Great Commission course. One of our missionaries in the field, Johan Menkes, he's from the Navy, and he's on the Congo River mission. He needs prayer. He's suffering from a second bout of malaria. He's got typhoid, and he's picked up some other infections. So Johan Menkes in the Congo River, in Kisangani at the moment, I think. Please pray for him, support him, pray for God to heal him of all these afflictions, that he can be effective. He's been in the field since September, and he's on his own. He needs co-workers to come with him. So if anyone's interested in working in the heart of darkness at Congo River Mission, which is one of the toughest, most needy mission fields around, they should come to our Great Commission course, where we can prepare them for the field and then ship them out to go and join Johan in the field. Magnificent work. There's all kinds of other ministries coming up. We've got invitations to Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Mozambique. Please pray for us. See if you can go on our website, see about these different projects like the chaplains training program in Zambia, and see what you can do, and if you can help with sponsoring some of the indigenous language Bibles. We are trying to get enough Siswati Bibles for the prisoners in Eswatini and Kingdom of Swaziland, but also there's requests and demands for Bibles all over the country and across the board. And we need more Bibles in indigenous African languages, in Chichewa, in Shona, in Ndebele, in Bemba. So many different languages are desperately needing more Bibles, more print runs for those languages. So thank you so very much for considering Christmas at the Frontline.
Yeah, thank you for your inspiring message, Dr. Hammond. In closing, I'd like to read from John chapter 1, verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Thank you very much for joining us for From the Frontline. God bless and good night.